Shamai chuig vusimwi, Anya napchugig Luis. Greetings, my name is Luis.
Kamdot muvak nya Kelly Imulik. Greetings, my name is Kelly, and welcome to our Autumn Pipash Living Languages series, New Words.
In the previous episode, we discussed how borrowing words from Spanish was a frequent and natural occurrence for Autumn and Pipash speakers.
Yes, that was very interesting information, but also a little intense. Maybe this week we can just provide some examples of borrowed Spanish words without the detailed linguistic analysis.
Sure, that sounds great.
You know, Luis, there are some Spanish words that were borrowed so long ago that most Autumn and Pipash speakers don't even realize they were originally Spanish words. They just assume they've always been words in our languages.
That's true. There are even a few instances where the borrowing occurred so long ago that the words are no longer commonly used in Spanish. Some words have become antiquated in Spanish, but continue to exist in the Autumn and Pipash languages.
That definitely sounds like a topic we should consider for another episode. For this episode, let's focus on some obvious Spanish loanwords, words that most Autumn and Pipash speakers recognize as being borrowed from Spanish. Many of these will be recognizable to Spanish speakers as well.
Let's start with some Spanish words that were borrowed by both languages.
Sounds good. We have a few examples already from our previous episodes.
Yes, we've already covered words such as lunes, the Spanish word for Monday, that is runas in Autumn.
And ya lunes in Pipash.
We also covered the Spanish word papas, meaning potatoes, which is babas in Autumn.
In Pipash, this borrowed word is pap.
The Spanish word pastel is paster in Autumn.
The Pipash word for pie is pastel.
Spanish cuchara is cusar in Autumn.
And the Pipash word for spoon is cuchar.
Kelly, can you think of any more Spanish words that both Autumn and Pipash borrowed?
I can think of a few more examples off the top of my head. The Spanish word for butter is mantequilla. In Pipash, we say mantequi. I know Autumn uses a similar word. How is it pronounced in Autumn?
It is similar, but some of the sounds are slightly different. The Autumn word for butter is mandaguilla.
Another word I know both languages borrowed is the Spanish word for coffee. In Pipash, we say café. We don't have an F sound in Pipash, but we do use an F sound in a few borrowed words. So if you ever hear a Pipash word with an F sound in it, it's a borrowed word from Spanish.
The Autumn word is coffee. Autumn changed the F sound to a V. Here's another example. I know the Spanish word for cowboy, vaquero, was also borrowed by Autumn and Pipash speakers. What do you call a cowboy in Pipash?
We say paquier for cowboy. What's the Autumn word?
The Autumn word is vaquiar.
I'm thinking of a loan word I know exists in both languages, but in Pipash we have different versions of it. The word is sugar, from the Spanish word azúcar. In Pipash, I have heard speakers say azúcar, arzuk, and arzúcar. They're all similar, but slightly different.
It seems like different Pipash speakers may have used different strategies when borrowing this word. So we end up with several variants that are similar enough that speakers understand one another, regardless of which form they use. Autumn also has some variation. Some people say azugar, while others say azuga.
So even within the same language community, there might be slight differences in the borrowing process.
That's correct. Consider how English speakers pronounce the Arizona city Casa Grande. This Spanish name was borrowed by English speakers. Some English speakers might say Casa Grande or Casa Grande or some other variation. Different people may have different preferences, but it usually doesn't create a communication issue.
That's a good comparison. Sometimes I'll even change my pronunciation of Casa Grande if I know the person I'm talking to says it a different way. I just thought of another good loan word. From the Spanish word americano, we get the Pipash word american, but the meaning of this word in Pipash is slightly different. In Pipash, this originally referred to people identified as Americans or citizens of the United States of America, most of whom were of European descent, at least at the time we first encountered them. So this word in Pipash is often used when referring to light-skinned people of European descent who may or may not actually be American.
The Autumn equivalent is mergan. The meaning of this word in Autumn is similar to the Pipash word. It's pretty common for borrowed words to take on new or additional meanings that may not exist in the original language.
Can you think of another example in Autumn and Pipash where the borrowed word has a slightly different meaning from Spanish?
Yes. Consider the Spanish word Santo, which means saint in Spanish. Did Pipash borrow this word?
Yes, we have the word sant in Pipash. I guess it can mean saint, but usually it's used in reference to the Catholic Church or someone who is of the Catholic religion. Basically, it means Catholic.
O'odham has the word Santo that also means Catholic. So this is another example of a word that's been borrowed but has taken on a related but slightly different meaning.
That's interesting. So we sometimes borrow a word and modify the sounds, and we sometimes also modify the meaning.
Yes, if you'll recall from our first episode, I referred to this as a semantic change. Again, this is probably a great topic for another episode.
Yes, I do remember you saying that. I know there are also numerous examples where O'odham borrowed a particular Spanish word, but Pipash did not, and vice versa. Luis, can you share some O'odham words borrowed from Spanish that Pipash didn't borrow?
From our first episode, we showed that O'odham borrowed domingo, the Spanish word for Sunday, and the result is domic. Pipash didn't borrow this word. Another good example is piast, borrowed from the Spanish word fiesta.
That's true. Pipash did not borrow this word, but we're quite familiar with it. It's not part of our language, but when we hear an O'odham person say there's a piast this weekend, our ears still perk up.
If you're having a piast, you're usually going to have vaira, which comes from the Spanish word bailar, to dance. Here too is a difference in meaning. The O'odham language already had a word for dance, chudk, but this word is now used primarily for traditional O'odham dancing. Vaira means dance, but it only refers to the style of dancing that was borrowed from the Spanish-Mexican culture.
So O'odham speakers could have expanded the meaning of the O'odham word for dance, but instead they chose to borrow a word to distinguish the borrowed dance form. That's pretty clever. Let's have a couple more O'odham examples to wrap up this episode.
Sure. Here are a few O'odham words that most speakers recognize as being borrowed from Spanish. We have the word for horse, caballo, which in O'odham is caballo. The word for cheese, which in Spanish is queso, in O'odham we say guiso. The word for onion, in Spanish is cebolla, in O'odham we say cebor. The word for pig, which is cochi in Spanish, in O'odham we say coji. The word for cook, in Spanish is cocinero, in O'odham we say cocinier. The word for bell, which in Spanish is campana, in O'odham we say campañ. The word for soldier, which in Spanish is soldado, in O'odham we say xondar. The word for bag, which in Spanish is costal, in O'odham we say costar. The word for key, which in Spanish is llave, in O'odham we say llav. And lastly, the word for axe, which in Spanish is hacha, in O'odham we say haça.
Here are a few Pipash words that most speakers recognize as being borrowed from Spanish. In some cases, they didn't change very much from Spanish, and speakers may recognize them. You're a speaker of Spanish, Luis. I'm going to say these Pipash words and let me know if you recognize the Spanish word. Pan.
That comes from the word for bread, which in Spanish is pan.
The next word is pez.
That comes from the word for money, which in Spanish is peso.
Aj.
That has to be the word for garlic, which in Spanish is ajo.
Jabón.
That's an easy one. That's the word for soap, which in Spanish is jabón.
Papel.
That's the word for paper, which in Spanish is papel.
Cien.
That comes from the Spanish word for 100, which is cien.
Mil.
That's the word for 1,000, which in Spanish is mil.
Capitán.
That's the word for captain, which in Spanish is capitán.
Carret.
That's the word for a wagon, which in Spanish is carreta.
Naranj.
And that's the word for orange, which in Spanish we say naranja. Borrowing words from another language is a natural way to create new words. We've shared just a few examples of words O'odham and Pipash speakers have borrowed from Spanish in the past.
Yes, some of them are pretty obvious, like the examples shared in this episode, but there are also some borrowed words that are not so obvious that we may cover at another time.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of New Words, and tune in for more episodes to learn how our languages have grown and adapted over time. Dova upam nui.
Yudncha.